From New York, this is Democracy Now!
Politicians in my home state and all across America, in their craven lust for power, have launched a full-fledged assault on voting rights. They are focused on winning at any cost, even the cost of the democracy itself.
In his first speech from the Senate floor, Georgia Democrat Senator Reverend Raphael Warnock condemns Republican voter suppression efforts as Jim Crow in new clothes. We'll air his moving address by the first black Democrat elected to the Senate from a former Confederate state. Then we speak to Heather McGhee, author of The Sum of Us, What Racism Costs Everyone and How We Can Prosper Together.
The Sum of Us is the story of my journey across the country, from Maine to Mississippi to California and back again, talking to Americans of all backgrounds who reveal to me that the biggest impediment to our progress as a nation is the zero-sum idea that progress for people of color has to come at white folks' expense.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. President Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris are meeting with local Asian American leaders in Atlanta, Georgia today in the wake of Tuesday's mass shooting in which a white man killed 8 people, 6 of them women of Asian descent. Harris is the first Asian American and the first woman vice president. At a congressional hearing Thursday on the rise of anti-Asian violence, California Democratic Congressmember Ted Lieu called for an end to the racist rhetoric used by some politicians since the start of the pandemic, namely former President Trump.
You can say racist, stupid stuff if you want, but I'm asking you to please stop using racist terms like Kung Flu or Wuhan virus or other ethnic identifiers in describing this virus. I am not a virus. And when you say things like that, it hurts the Asian American community.
Meanwhile, Congressmember Chip Roy of Texas decided to glorify lynchings at the hearing intended to combat racism and xenophobia.
There's old sayings in Texas about, find all the rope in Texas and get a tall oak tree.
New York Congressmember Grace Meng responded to Roy's comments.
Your president and your party and your colleagues can talk about issues with any other country that you want, but you don't have to do it by putting a bullseye on the back of Asian Americans across this country, on our grandparents, on our kids. This hearing was to address the hurt and pain of our community, to find solutions, and we will not let you take our voice away from us.
Last week, Congressmember Meng reintroduced her resolution denouncing anti-Asian hate crimes and discrimination amidst the pandemic. Meanwhile, former President Obama called for common-sense gun control laws Wednesday. Biden has yet to raise the issue publicly since the shooting, but called on Congress last month to pass new gun control legislation. About a dozen nations, including Germany, France, Italy, and Spain, have resumed use of Oxford's AstraZeneca vaccine after Europe's top regulator declared the shot safe and effective. The European Medicines Agency investigated 25 cases of rare blood clots among some 20 million people who've received AstraZeneca inoculations. It's not known whether the vaccine caused the blood clots, and health officials say its benefits far outweigh the risks. Meanwhile, the Biden administration said it plans to ship about 4 million doses of U.S.-made AstraZeneca vaccine to Mexico and Canada. The vaccine's not yet approved for use in the U.S., and millions of vials have been piling up in U.S. warehouses, prompting criticism of vaccine hoarding. The White House says the vaccine shipments would have to be repaid, effectively making them a loan. On Thursday, the United States recorded nearly 60,000 new coronavirus infections and over 1,600 COVID-19 deaths. Daily infections have largely plateaued and are rising in over a dozen states, even as the White House marks its goal today of delivering 100 million doses within President Biden's first 100 days. On Capitol Hill, Chief White House Medical Advisor Dr. Anthony Fauci clashed with Kentucky Republican Senator Dr. Rand Paul over the use of masks. Senator Paul questioned why people who've recovered from COVID-19 or who had the vaccine should continue to wear masks.
You want people to get the vaccine? Give them a reward instead of telling them that the nanny state's going to be there for 3 more years and you got to wear a mask forever. People don't want to hear it. There's no science behind it.
Well, let me just state for the record that masks are not theater. Masks are protective. And we
have immunity there, theater. If you already have immunity, you're wearing a mask to give comfort to others. You're not wearing a mask because of any science.
I totally disagree with you.
Dr. Fauci pushed back, saying there's not enough data on whether people with immunity to COVID-19 can still spread the virus that causes the disease. He also warned new viral variants may be able to reinfect people who have immunity to earlier lineages of coronavirus. The Senate narrowly confirmed Javier Becerra to lead the Department of Health and Human Services Thursday, with just one Republican, Maine's Susan Collins, voting in his favor. Becerra will play a key role in the government's response to the pandemic. The Senate also confirmed William Burns as CIA director. Burns was involved in talks leading to the landmark Iran nuclear deal under President Obama. Meanwhile, Deb Haaland was sworn in by Vice President Kamala Harris Thursday as head of the Interior Department, the first ever Native American cabinet secretary. Haaland, a member of the Laguna Pueblo tribe, wore a traditional indigenous ribbon skirt and moccasins for the occasion.
So help me God.
So help me God.
Congratulations, Madam Secretary. Congratulations. Congratulations. History is being made yet again.
The House of Representatives passed 2 immigration bills that would establish a pathway to citizenship or legal residency for undocumented people brought to the U.S. as children, some immigrants with temporary protected status, as well as undocumented farm workers. The American Dream and Promise Act would largely apply to people with DACA, that's Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, and will reportedly benefit some 2.5 million undocumented immigrants. The second bill, the Farm Workforce Modernization Act, would allow about 1 million undocumented farm workers to get a green card if they pay a penalty and continue to work in the industry for 4 to 8 more years. While some advocates have celebrated the bills, many are denouncing the exclusion of millions of other undocumented people, including those who've been convicted of a crime. Jacinta Gonzalez, senior campaign organizer at Mi Gente, said, quote, "If we learned anything in 2020, it's that the policing and mass incarceration systems in this country are fundamentally rigged against Black and Latinx people, and the American Dream and Promise Act is no exception. Criminalization born of a racist system cannot be the measure by which we determine who belongs and who goes," she said. The bills now head to the Senate, where they face an uphill battle as 10 Republicans would have to vote with every Democrat to pass the legislation. In more immigration news, more than 14,000 unaccompanied migrant children are now in the custody of U.S. officials. Most are being detained at facilities run by Health and Human Services, and some 4,500 children are still in the custody of Customs and Border Protection. Meanwhile, the Biden administration stopped sending unaccompanied migrant teenagers to a recently opened facility in Midland, Texas, amidst growing safety and other concerns. The facility is a converted camp for oil field workers, where most of the Red Cross volunteers on site don't speak Spanish or indigenous languages. Already over 50 teens out of nearly 500 in custody in Midland have tested positive for COVID-19. The House of Representatives voted Thursday to award congressional gold medals to all members of the Capitol Police Force over their role in battling the mob of Trump supporters that attacked Congress on January 6th. A dozen pro-Trump Republicans voted against the measure, citing objections to language that referred to the January 6th Capitol assault as an insurrection. The U.S. and China traded tense verbal attacks as the first high-level talks between the two countries since the start of the Biden administration kicked off in Alaska Thursday. This is Secretary of State Antony Blinken.
I have to tell you, what I'm hearing is very different from what you described. I'm hearing deep satisfaction that the United States is back, that we're re-engaged with our allies and partners. I'm also hearing deep concern about some of the actions your government is taking.
The U.S. accused China of threatening global stability and raised human rights issues. China, meanwhile, said the U.S. is using its military and economic might to carry out its own national priorities and, quote, incite some countries to attack China. This is senior Chinese diplomat Yang Jiechi.
So we hope that when talking about universal values or international public opinion on the part of the United States, we hope that the U.S. side will think about whether it feels reassured saying those things, because the U.S. does not represent the world. It only represents the government of the United States.
And in Egypt, prominent human rights activist Sana Seif has been sentenced to 18 months in prison after a court found her guilty of so-called spreading fake news. Seif was detained last June and was later accused of making false claims regarding the massive spread of COVID-19 inside Egyptian prisons. Amnesty International called her charges bogus and said, quote, stemming purely from her peaceful criticism. During the revolution in 2011, Sana Seif, who was then just 17 years old, spoke with Democracy Now's Sharif Abdel-Quddus about publishing a newspaper in defiance of rules requiring government permission.
It's the perfect timing to push the borders of freedom further. So we thought, why not? Let's make a newspaper and let's not get permissions for that. Let's just sell it in the streets. It's called Voices of Tahrir, Voices of Liberation, and we thought that the first copy has to be like, well, each one of us after this experience of the revolution has something to say.
Again, Sana Seif has been sentenced to 1.5 years in an Egyptian prison. Those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. When we come back, Georgia Democratic Senator Reverend Raphael Warnock condemns Republican voter suppression efforts as Jim Crow in new clothes will air his first speech from the Senate floor. Stay with us.
Gonna lay down my sword and shield down by the riverside, down by the riverside, down by the riverside. I'm gonna lay down my sword and shield down by the riverside. Ain't gonna study war no more. I ain't gonna study war no more.
Sweet Honey in the Rock, down by the riverside, performing in our old downtown community television studios in an old firehouse studio in 2003 as we continue to dig into our archives throughout this 25th anniversary year of Democracy Now! This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Senate Democrats have introduced sweeping voting rights legislation passed by the House of Representatives earlier this month. The For the People Act aims to improve voter registration and access to the polls, ends partisan and racial gerrymandering, forces the disclosure of dark money donors, increases public funding for candidates, and imposes strict ethical and reporting standards on members of Congress and the U.S. Supreme Court. Republicans have signaled they'll use the filibuster to defeat the bill. This comes as voting rights are under attack in courthouses and state houses across the country. Republican state lawmakers have introduced over 250 bills in 43 states to limit voter access. Meanwhile, the Supreme Court appears poised to uphold controversial voting limits in Arizona in a case that would further gut the Voting Rights Act. We turn now to newly elected Georgia Democratic Senator Raphael Warnock's first Senate speech. He's the first black senator to represent Georgia and the first black Democrat to be elected to the Senate in the South. Reverend Warnock is also a pastor of the Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, which was the spiritual home of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. Now, Senator Warnock focused on voting rights in his maiden floor speech, but he began by condemning the deadly shootings at the 3 spas in the Atlanta region on Tuesday that left 8 people dead, including 7 women, 6 of whom were of Asian descent.
Mr. President, before I begin my formal remarks, I want to pause to condemn the hatred and violence that took 8 precious lives last night in metropolitan Atlanta. I grieve with Georgians, with Americans, with people of love all across the world. This unspeakable violence visited largely upon the Asian community is one that causes all of us to recommit ourselves to the way of peace, an active peace that prevents these kinds of tragedies from happening in the first place. We pray for these families. Mr. President, I rise here today as a proud American and as one of the newest members of the Senate in awe of the journey that has brought me to these hallowed halls, and with an abiding sense of reverence and gratitude for the faith and sacrifices of ancestors who paved the way. I am a proud son of the great state of Georgia, born and raised in Savannah, a coastal city known for its cobblestone streets and verdant town squares. Towering oak trees, centuries old and covered in gray Spanish moss, stretch from one side of the street to the other, bend and beckon the lover of history and horticulture to this city by the sea. I was educated at Morehouse College, and I still serve in the pulpit of the Ebenezer Baptist Church, both in Atlanta, the cradle of the civil rights movement. And so, like those oak trees in Savannah, my roots go down deep, and they stretch wide in the soil of Waycross, Georgia, and Burke County, and Scriven County. In a word, I am Georgia, a living example and embodiment of its history and its hope, of its pain and promise, the brutality and possibility. Mr. President, at the time of my birth, Georgia's two senators were Richard B. Russell and Herman E. Talmadge, both arch segregationists and unabashed adversaries of the civil rights movement. After the Supreme Court's landmark Brown versus Board ruling outlawing school segregation, Talmadge warned that blood will run in the streets of Atlanta. Senator Talmadge's father, Eugene Talmadge, former governor of our state, had famously declared, "The South loves the Negro in his place, but his place is at the back door." When once asked how he and his supporters might keep black people away from the polls, he picked up a scrap of paper and wrote a single word on it: pistols. Yet there is something in the American covenant, in its charter documents, and its Jeffersonian ideals that bends toward freedom. And led by a preacher and a patriot named King, Americans of all races stood up. History vindicated the movement that sought to bring us closer to our ideals, to lengthen and strengthen the cords of our democracy. And I now hold the seat, the Senate seat, where Herman E. Talmadge sat. And that's why I love America. I love America because we always have a path to make it better, to build a more perfect union. It is a place where a kid like me who grew up in public housing, first college graduate in my family, can now stand as a United States Senator. I had an older father. He was born in 1917. Serving in the Army during World War II, he was once asked to give up his seat to a young teenager while wearing his soldier's uniform. They said making the world safe for democracy. But he was never bitter. And by the time I came along, he had already seen the arc of change in our country. And he maintained his faith in God and in his family and in the American promise, and he passed that faith on to his children. My mother grew up in Waycross, Georgia. You know where that is? It's way across Georgia. And like a lot of black teenagers in the 1950s, she spent her summers picking somebody else's tobacco and somebody else's cotton. But because this is America, the 82-year-old hands that used to pick somebody else's cotton went to the polls in January and picked her youngest son to be a United States Senator. Ours is a land where possibility is born of democracy, a vote, a voice, a chance to help determine the direction of the country and one's own destiny within it. Possibility born of democracy. That's why this past November and January, my mom and other citizens of Georgia grabbed hold of that possibility and turned out in record numbers, 5 million in November, 4.4 million in January, far more than ever in our state's history. Turnout for a typical runoff doubled. And the people of Georgia sent their first African-American senator and first Jewish senator, my brother John Ossoff, to these hallowed halls. But then what happened? Some politicians did not approve of the choice made by the majority of voters in a hard-fought election in which each side got the chance to make its case to the voters. And rather than adjusting their agenda, rather than changing their message, they are busy trying to change the rules. We are witnessing right now a massive and unabashed assault on voting rights unlike anything we've ever seen since the Jim Crow era. This is Jim Crow in new clothes. Since the January election, some 250 voter suppression bills have been introduced by state legislatures all across the country, from Georgia to Arizona, from New Hampshire to Florida, using the big lie of voter fraud as a pretext for voter suppression. The same big lie that led to a violent insurrection on this very Capitol the day after my election. Within 24 hours, we elected Georgia's first African-American Jewish senator, and hours later, the Capitol was assaulted. We see in just a few precious hours the tension very much alive in the soul of America. And the question before all of us at every moment is, what will we do to push us in the right direction? And so politicians driven by that big lie aim to severely limit and in some cases eliminate automatic and same-day voter registration, mail-in and absentee voting, and early voting and weekend voting. They want to make it easier to purge voters from the voting roll altogether. And as a voting rights activist, I've seen up close just how draconian these measures can be. I hail from a state that purged 200,000 voters from the roll one Saturday night, in the middle of the night. We know what's happening here. Some people don't want some people to vote. I was honored on a few occasions to stand with our hero and my parishioner, John Lewis. I was his pastor, but I'm clear he was my mentor. On more than one occasion, we boarded buses together after Sunday church services as part of our Souls to the Polls program, encouraging the Ebenezer Church family and communities of faith to participate in the democratic process. Now, just a few months after Congressman Lewis's death, there are those in the Georgia legislature, some who even dared to praise his name, that are now trying to get rid of Sunday souls to the polls, making it a crime for people who pray together to get on a bus together in order to vote together. I think that's wrong. Matter of fact, I think that a vote is a kind of prayer for the kind of world we desire for ourselves and for our children. And our prayers are stronger when we pray together. To be sure, we have seen these kinds of voter suppression tactics before. They are a part of a long and shameful history in Georgia and throughout our nation, but refusing to be denied. Georgia citizens and citizens across our country brave the heat and the cold and the rain, some standing in line for 5 hours, 6 hours, 10 hours, just to exercise their constitutional right to vote. Young people, old people, sick people, working people, already underpaid, forced to lose wages, to pay a kind of poll tax while standing in line to vote. And how do some politicians respond? Well, they're trying to make it a crime to give people water and a snack as they wait in lines that are obviously being made longer by their draconian actions. Think about that. Think about that. They're the ones making the lines longer through these draconian actions. And then they want to make it a crime to bring grandma some water while she's waiting in a line that they're making longer. Make no mistake, this is democracy in reverse. Rather than voters being able to pick the politicians are trying to cherry pick their voters. I say this cannot stand. And so I rise, Mr. President, because that sacred and noble idea, one person, one vote, is being threatened right now. Politicians in my home state and all across America, in their craven lust for power, have launched a full-fledged assault on voting rights. They are focused on winning at any cost, even the cost of the democracy itself. And I submit that it is the job of each citizen to stand up for the voting rights of every citizen. And it is the job of this body to do all that it can to defend the viability of our democracy. And that's why I am a proud co-sponsor of the For the People Act, which we introduced today. The For the People Act is a major step in the march toward our democratic ideals, making it easier, not harder, for eligible Americans to vote by instituting common sense pro-democracy reforms, like establishing national automatic voter registration for every eligible citizen, and allowing all Americans to register to vote online and on Election Day, requiring states to offer at least 2 weeks of early voting, including weekends, in federal elections, keeping Souls to the Polls programs alive, prohibiting states from restricting a person's ability to vote absentee or by mail, and preventing states from purging the voter rolls based solely on unreliable evidence like someone's voting history, something we've seen in Georgia and other states in recent years. And it would end the dominance of big money in our politics and ensure our public servants are there serving the public. Amidst these voter suppression laws and tactics, including partisan and racial gerrymandering, And in a system awash in dark money and the dominance of corporatist interests and politicians who do their bidding, the voices of the American people have been increasingly drowned out and crowded out and squeezed out of their own democracy. We must pass for the people so that the people might have a voice. Your vote is your voice, and your voice is your human dignity. But not only that, we must pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. You know, voting rights used to be a bipartisan issue. The last time the voting rights bill was reauthorized was 2006. George W. Bush was president, and it passed this chamber 98-0. But then in 2013, the Supreme Court rejected the successful formula for supervision and pre-clearance contained in the 1965 Voting Rights Act. They asked Congress to fix it. That was nearly 8 years ago. And the American people are still waiting. Stripped of protections, voters in states with a long history of voter discrimination and voters in many other states have been thrown to the winds. We Americans have noisy and spirited debates about many things, and we should. That's what it means to live in a free country. But access to the ballot ought to be nonpartisan. I submit that there should be 100 votes in this chamber for policies that will make it easier for Americans to make their voices heard in our democracy. Surely, there ought to be at least 60 in this chamber who believe, as I do, that the four most powerful words uttered in a democracy are "the people have spoken." Therefore, we must ensure that all of the people can speak. But if not, we must still pass voting rights. The right to vote is preservative of all other rights. It is not just another issue alongside other issues. It is foundational. It is a reason why any of us has the privilege of standing here in the first place. It is about the covenant we have with one another as an American people, e pluribus unum, out of many one. It, above all else, must be protected. And so let's be clear. I'm not here today to spiral into the procedural argument regarding whether the filibuster in general has merits or has outlived its usefulness. I'm here to say that this issue is bigger than the filibuster. I stand before you saying that this issue, access to voting and preempting politicians' efforts to restrict voting, is so fundamental to our democracy that it is too important to be held hostage by a Senate rule, especially one historically used to restrict expansion of voting rights. It is a contradiction to say we must protect minority rights in the Senate while refusing to protect minority rights in the society. Colleagues, no Senate rule should overrule the integrity of our democracy. And we must find a way to pass voting rights whether we get rid of the filibuster or not. And so as I close, and nobody believes a preacher when he says as I close, let me say that I, as a man of faith, I believe that democracy is the political enactment of a spiritual idea. The sacred worth of all human beings. The notion that we all have within us a spark of the divine and a right to participate in the shaping of our destiny Reinhold Niebuhr was right. Humanity's capacity for justice makes democracy possible, but humanity's inclination to injustice makes democracy necessary. John Lewis understood that and was beaten on a bridge defending it. Amelia Boynton, like so many women not mentioned nearly enough, was gassed on that same bridge. A white woman named Viola Luiso was killed. Medgar Evers was murdered in his own driveway. Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodman, two Jews and an African American standing up for that sacred idea of democracy, also paid the ultimate price. And we in this body would be stopped and stymied by partisan politics, short-term political gain, Senate procedure. I say let's get this done no matter what. I urge my colleagues to pass these two bills, strengthen and lengthen the cords of our democracy, secure our credibility as the premier voice for freedom-loving people and democratic movements all over the world, and win the future for all of our children. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
That's Georgia's new Democratic Senator, the Reverend Raphael Warnock, giving his first speech from the Senate floor. In a rare display in the Senate, the people in the room gave him a standing ovation. When we come back, we speak to Heather McGhee, author of the new book, The Sum of Us, What Racism Costs Everyone and How We Can Prosper Together. Stay with us.
Now we've been viewed and we've been scorned. We've been talked about, sure as you born. But we'll never turn back. No, we'll never turn back until we walk in peace.
We'll Never Turn Back by Mavis Staples. The 81-year-old legend just got her second dose of a coronavirus vaccine. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris head to Atlanta today, where they plan to address Tuesday's mass shootings at 3 spas that killed 8 people, including 7 women, 6 of whom were of Asian descent. The trip to Atlanta was originally scheduled as part of Biden's campaign promoting the nearly $2 trillion American Rescue Plan. Democrats hailed the deal as the largest anti-poverty law in a generation. One study projects it will lift almost 14 million Americans out of poverty, including 5.7 million children. While the relief plan has broad public support, not a single Republican supported the legislation. We spend the rest of the hour with Heather McGhee, author of the new book, The Sum of Us, What Racism Costs Everyone and How We Can Prosper Together. Heather is the board chair of Color of Change and former president of the think tank Demos. Thanks so much for joining us, Heather. Congratulations on your new book.
Thank you. Congratulations on 25 years.
Thank you so much. The whole team at Democracy Now! Is celebrating. Hopefully soon we can celebrate together. Well, You just sat there and watched once again the Reverend Warnock. You tweeted while he was speaking and said everyone should do themselves a favor and watch this speech. Can you talk about the significance of what happened in Georgia for this whole country? Reverend Warnock, the first Black Democrat to be elected from the former Confederacy.
Yeah, it was so moving. I mean, I really think of the crucible of the 24 hours between January 5th and January 6th as American promise and American peril in a nutshell. First, we saw a multiracial coalition, a multiracial anti-racist coalition that was standing up to 4 years of division, pain, and suffering, and putting the man who is the successor to Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, marching through the pews of that storied church and putting him in office along with John Ossoff. That was an historic moment. So many of the political class had counted Georgia out, and yet a coalition that went from Black folks who had been organizing for years with Stacey Abrams and LaTosha Brown, to white women in the suburbs who turned away from the Republican Party for the first time in generations, young people really overcoming a number of barriers to the ballot in the middle of a pandemic, did the impossible with the promise of relief from this pandemic, itself a disease that has wreaked havoc disproportionately on people of color, but that has shown that our fates are inextricably linked. And then not 24 hours later, the dark spirit of American white supremacy, fueled by a big lie that has as its core logic racism, the idea, the common sense that, of course, a man who was rejected by the majority of people of color could not possibly have lost the presidency. That, of course, when people of color vote, it is somehow suspect and criminal. This is the tension, and I explore this tension in my book because fundamentally, racism has been the most powerful tool wielded against the best of America, against American democracy, against cross-racial solidarity, against the American dream itself. I talk about how it's brought us the inequality era, and figures like Reverend Warnock, who put into perspective, who in their own lives have so much of the course of American history on display, are whom we need to look to right now to remind us that that tool always robs this country of its best promise.
You mentioned Stacey Abrams. Georgia's state Senate recently approved a bill that would end the right of voters to cast absentee ballots without excuse, while toughening voter ID requirements. Georgia voting rights activist, the former gubernatorial candidate Stacey Abrams, blasted the legislation on CNN.
I do absolutely agree that it's racist. It is a redux of Jim Crow in a suit and tie. We know that the only thing that precipitated these changes, it's not that there was a question of security. In fact, the Secretary of State and the governor went to great pains to assure America that Georgia's elections were secure. And so the only connection that we can find is that more people of color voted, and it changed the outcome of elections in a direction that Republicans do not like.
So that's Stacey Abrams. And, of course, it's not just Georgia. It's all over the country. Over 250 bills now introduced in legislatures around the country, as you've said. I mean, the idea of the Republicans, what, if you can't beat them, join them? Like, just legally stop them from voting.
Yeah. Well, I mean, let's be very clear that this is the question that has bedeviled this nation since its founding. Are we going to be a democracy, or are we going to be a white supremacist state? Our founders had a revolutionary idea to break with the European tradition of monarchy and bet on the radical idea of self-governance, and yet they compromised their own ideals from the start to compromise with slavery. They drilled holes into the bedrock of American democracy at the beginning with compromises such as the Electoral College to ensure a voice for slave states, the three-fifths compromise, and then, of course, allowing the first Congress to delineate citizenship only to free white citizens, free white persons. And so we've seen time and time again, all of these tactics are from a very old playbook. They're from a playbook that is deployed by a narrow white elite. And the thing that I try to outline in my book, I have a whole chapter on the way that democracy has always been subverted by racism, deployed by a narrow white elite, is that the costs of these kinds of voter suppression tactics, both in the Jim Crow era and today, of course, hit their target, right? Of course, they disproportionately and first and worst impact Black Americans and brown and indigenous Americans whom they're targeting, but they also impact young people of all races. They make it harder for white people to vote as well. This is why, when Demos took a case to the Supreme Court against the purges of the voter rolls for people who had just not voted in an election in 2 elections in a row, our lead plaintiff was Larry Harmon, a white, middle-aged Ohioan Navy veteran. This is what happens. People get caught in a trap not set for them. During the Jim Crow era, the southern states suffered a slow death of civic life. It was because of things like the poll tax and the grandfather clause and the restrictions by force on the right to vote. It meant that working class white people didn't vote either, and it meant that there was one-party rule by a white segregationist elite that didn't even have to compete for votes. And so it didn't invest in the South. It left the South lagging behind on core public investments, because when you don't have a functioning democracy, you don't have public goods. You don't have a thriving economy. That's the Republicans' vision. They want a plantation democracy and a plantation economy, but we're not going to let them have that.
So let's talk about the central image of your new book, The Sum of Us, What Racism Costs Everyone, and how we can prosper together. Let's talk about that swimming pool, a drained swimming pool, Heather.
So my book is about the way that after 20 years of trying to do what I thought was very sensible, which was bring economic data and to policymakers to get them to make better economic policy decisions, I left the think tank world and went on a journey across the country. And one of the first trips that I made was to Montgomery, Alabama, where there's a central park called Oak Park. And it used to be really the beating heart of the city. And in the middle of Oak Park, there used to be one of what was at one point nearly 2,000 grand resort-style public swimming pools. And these weren't just any kinds of swimming pools. These were pools that held over 1,000 swimmers at a time, and they were built in a building boom of public amenities in the 1930s and 40s. In the New Deal era, Amy, where we saw a government ethos that said it is the government's job to lift the standard of living of our people, to provide protections for workers, to invest in a heretofore completely unthought of idea, which is that working class people would be able to own a home with no down payment and stretching it out over 30 years, through to the GI Bill, which was a massive investment in economic security and created a white middle class. And I say a white middle class because virtually all of those public investments and protections that I just described were for whites only, either by design, such as with the mortgage market and the redlined housing maps, to the GI Bill, which was race neutral on its face, but excluded millions of Black GIs. The swimming pools across the country, in so many places, not just in the South, were also segregated and for whites only. And when the civil rights movement empowered Black families to say, hey, those are our tax dollars, we want our kids to swim too, what did white-controlled towns do instead of integrating them? All across the country, but definitely in Oak Park in Montgomery, Alabama, where I visited, they drained the public pool rather than integrate them. They took out the water, poured in dirt, seeded it over with grass. In Montgomery, they kept the entire Parks and Recreation Department closed for a decade to avoid integration. I went, as I said, to Oak Park, and I walked the grounds. Even after they reopened the park, they never rebuilt the pool. And for me, that was a perfect image of what's happened to the American economy. As the majority of white voters turned their backs on the party of the New Deal, the party that had really guaranteed middle-class security for white America when that promise was extended across the color line during the Civil Rights Movement. And Lyndon Johnson then became the last Democrat to win the majority of white voters, even until today.
I wanted to go to Bessemer, Alabama, and this is an issue that is very dear to your heart. You went there. Amazon workers continuing to vote on whether to become the first unionized Amazon warehouse in the country. They're demanding stronger COVID safety measures and relief from impossibly high productivity standards that leave many unable to take even bathroom breaks. Upwards of 80% of the Bessemer workers are Black. The majority are women. Last month, we spoke to Jennifer Bates, a worker and organizer at Amazon's warehouse in Bessemer. She just testified also before Congress. This was what she said on our show.
Well, the reason why we're organizing is because we need an even playing field. Some of the conditions that are in there are being ignored by human resources, long work hours with only 2 breaks. So we want to be heard. We want to be treated like people and not ignored when we have issues. People are getting fired without having their opportunity to speak their side.
That is Amazon organizer Jennifer Bates speaking to us from Bessemer, from the Union Hall. Can you tell us, Heather McGhee, about the significance of this battle? If they win, they will be the first warehouse to be unionized. Amazon is pouring millions into fighting them, even trying to change the traffic light outside the warehouse, because when people stop, organizers would go over and talk to them in their cars. But can you talk about this and other places you visited that didn't win in their strike, in their unionizing attempts?
In the Sum of Us, I basically asked the question at the outset, why is it we can't seem to have nice things in America? And by nice things, I don't mean self-driving cars or laundry that does itself. I mean things like wages that keep workers out of poverty, universal health care, childcare, reliable infrastructure. And for me, the right to bargain, which is a human right, is one of those nice things that we can't seem to have in America anymore. And at its core, racism is the answer why. It's been the tool that bosses have used throughout our history to drive a wedge between Black and white workers, to give white workers a sense that they are a little bit superior to the Black workers on the line, and therefore don't need to link arms together and collectively bargain for better wages and benefits and power for everyone. I went to Mississippi, to Canton, Mississippi, in the wake of the failed UAW union organizing drive at a Nissan plant in 2017. And there I talked to workers, Black, white, for and against the union, who told me so clearly that the reason why the union vote failed was that race had been the tool to drive workers apart. That white workers' mentality was, if the Blacks are for it, I'm against it. That in the South in general, which is the region of the country with the lowest labor standards, and it's no surprise when you start a labor market in the South at exactly $0 in pay and a lash, then of course you are going to have just $7.25 an hour 2 centuries later. Of course you are going to have, or 1 century later, excuse me, after emancipation. Of course you are going to have this sort of plantation economy, this Jim Crow economy. But what I've seen when talking to workers in the South is they know that as the South goes, so goes the rest of the economy. The drive to low-wage work, born really in the modern era in Arkansas with Walmart, is now why there are so many factories and warehouses in the South where there's our right to work for less laws, where there's this anti-union organizing and ethos by the political elite. And yet in Bessemer, this is the crucible moment. This is the moment when we're going to see whether or not what is quickly becoming the dominant player in markets, in labor markets and in consumer retail markets, has to answer to the power of its workers, has to share power with its people. Even, yes, when those people are the people at the absolute bottom of the social and economic hierarchy, low-paid Black women workers. I think the answer is going to be yes. And I think that it's going to reverberate across the economy.
So, Heather McGhee, this is a remarkable week where you have the passage of the American Rescue Plan in the last week. That is the close to $2 trillion relief package that no Republican voted for, but already are touting it when they write fundraising letters and talk to their community about what they're bringing their communities. But talk about both the issue of how many children will be brought out of poverty in this country, but also the stripping of an issue that you have spent years fighting for, and that's the fight for the fight for $15 an hour minimum wage.
In the Some of Us, I visit with workers who are fighting for 15, who are fast food workers making a little over $7 an hour, Black and white, who were really at the vanguard of the movement in Kansas City, a Black worker named Terrence and a white worker named Bridget. And the vision that they spelled out to me of Black, white, and brown coming together to defeat the racism inherent in poverty wages, the racism inherent in not having a strong union and collective bargaining that puts people on an even playing field and amplifies everybody's voice, was what they needed to fight. Bridget told me, she said, listen, I used to believe the us versus them about the immigrants stealing jobs and Black people committing crimes. But she said, now I know, as long as we're divided, we're conquered. And I tell that story about Bridget and Terrence and the way that racism was used as a wedge to divide workers from their common problems to common solutions, to their common problems, because that is what is on display right now, that great tension. We had the American Rescue Plan, which is the biggest refilling of the public pool, the pool of public goods for the American people in my 40 years on this planet. It is a massive repudiation of the bipartisan austerity agenda that we have been left with in the wake of the civil rights movement that has degraded and eroded public goods, mostly because of white opposition to public goods for a public they no longer see as good, a more diverse public. You saw that Republicans knew that they could cavalierly vote against something that would help millions of white Americans as well as Black and brown Americans, because their messaging at the national level and in the right-wing media is that this is about Black and brown people. A Republican congresswoman said, I'm voting against this bill because Joe Biden's opening the border instead of opening schools. How is that helping our children? We saw immediately Fox News pivot towards the one provision that was for Black farmers who were left out of the trillions of dollars in aid that has been given over the past number of generations exclusively to white farmers, including the billions of dollars most recently in the Trump administration, where Black farmers were discriminated out of their fair share. This is the divide and conquer. This is trying to activate the zero sum. And the fact that we were not able
We have 10 seconds.
We were not able to get the minimum wage bill in there is really about the failure of a multiracial coalition to have the kind of enduring power that we need to lift the wages for all working people.
Heather McGhee, we want to thank you for being with us. We're going to post part 2 online at DemocracyNow.org. Author of the new book, The Sum of Us, What Racism Costs Everyone and How We Can Prosper Together. Heather McGhee, the board chair of Color of Change, former president of the think tank Demos. Happy birthday to Tammy Warrenoff. Remember, wearing a mask is an act of love. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks for joining us.